question about the assessors is not only their role, but also kind of their backgrounds. Like, who hires them? Where do they get their training? Do you have any background in understanding that? Yeah, that's a question.
That is, it's a good question because it's a little bit opaque. There are certification requirements of the state for appraisers, for private appraisers. But assessors, that's a little bit more of a gray area. And there's a distinction between what's a public assessor and what's a private appraiser. The assessor is there to calculate the full value of your property for purposes of taxation. The appraiser is there to come up with a fair market value of your facility or your property for purposes of a consensual sale and purchase between buyer and seller. So it's a different, it's similar but quite different really.
Yeah, that sounds pretty different actually. So does the city assessor use industry standards for property house assessments then?
Well, it does use standards, as we talked about the AAAO and the IAAO, but it's kind of like, do you use the metric system or do you use the imperial system?
Okay.
So you can say, I'm going to use the metric system, but how good is your ruler?
Yeah.
So if you got a cheap ruler that maybe isn't calibrated too well versus an expensive ruler or just a good ruler. And so you don't know if you have a good ruler until it's been calibrated and verified to be using the actual measurements that you know are consistent and thus can be compared from one to another. So even though the city says it's using some set of standards, it doesn't mean that you are getting some quality product unless that work, and that work is a thing called a mass assessment model. So they go out and they take each property and say it's got this many bedrooms, it's got this many bathrooms, it's got this kind of paint job, siding, whatever, roofing material. Very important for the individual taxpayer to look at the assessor's database and make sure that your property does have all the features, or perhaps different features from what the city is looking at. So let's make sure we all have the same facts. But once you've established that the city and you agree on the facts of what your property is, then they take those facts and enter them into this mass assessment model, which is kind of a black box, right? A model is a model. It's got equations in it and whatnot, and poof, you put stuff in, poof, stuff comes out the other end, and that's your assessment. But unless that model is calibrated, verified, and checked out for accuracy, you don't know what's really going on. So it's difficult for the taxpayer to determine the efficacy and efficiency and accuracy of those assessments. And that's kind of the place that most of us are.
Right.
How did you get that number? That's kind of a question that comes from that.
I hear that a lot.
So it's important, and it obligates people to go out and compare that. What did my neighbor get? What's their assessment? What was my assessment last year versus the year before? And see what the trend is. Keep tabs on, this is a recommendation, of course not what somebody absolutely positively has to do, but it's useful to look at the trends over time. What's happening to my property? Has it gone up? Has it gone down? Has it stayed level? And how is that related to my neighbors? And what we've seen in our research is that there can be quite disparate results for different properties, even neighbors side to side. So the city, they're doing thousands of structures, thousands of homes, thousands of pieces of property every year. So it's a big task.
Yeah, interesting story. I heard I would actually push for resources in looking up what your property value is. You can look on the parcel viewer. It is public. Just type in parcel viewer Juneau, Alaska. It should pop up right away, and you can go through the map and look at each plot and look at who owns it, who's owned it before, the square footage, and the price that it's valued at. So doing that, I had a friend look at their house and look at their neighbor's house. The reason they did that is they subdivided their piece of property. This piece of property is only 0.5 acres. So they subdivided in 2.5.
Still a pretty big lot.
It's 2.5, right? The initial assessment on the 0.5 was $200,000, okay? Their neighbor's $150,000, right? they go back after they've done their subdividing work, and now they go back on parcel viewer, and now they have their 2.5 and 2.5. Each 2.5 lot is worth $250,000, where their neighbor is still 0.5 acres at $150,000. So check that out. See?
Are they using a tool? Because you'd think that if a tool is being used,
Right.
and the measurements are being accurate,
Right.
there's no way that they could come up with that.
Yeah, we were very aghast when we went through this little, I guess you could say exercise or research project, because in the work we do, we look at land, right? We look at what land values are to help people decide whether.
And that had nothing to do with the home.
No, it had nothing.
Just
to do
the land
with
value.
Just the land value.
Principally, they are looking at comparables.
Mm-hmm.
There isn't a disclosure rule in Juneau, and that was the subject of a very recent election.
Mm-hmm.
But they're coming up with best estimates of actual sales of property, and then they're saying that was kind of like yours. So it's similar to what an appraiser does. He's looking for comparable sales and saying where do you fit in with those sales relative to those sales, and thus getting an estimate of the value of yours. So the assessor does something similar to an appraiser in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
My question for that, piggybacking off of that, is what is comparable though? Right, because we're Juneau's pretty unique. Only fly and only boating. What is that comparable?
Oh, into the community.
Oh, is it with the community, or are they
Absolutely.
comparing outside? Like I've heard, and this is also rumor mill. I've heard that they've used comparables of, oh well, in Oregon or in San Francisco, this is what's happening. So, or is it just within the community? What defines comparables? Is I guess the big question.
Well, that's a very good question. We don't have the absolute answer to that,
Okay.
that's for sure. It certainly should be within our own community because
Right.
the cost of living in Juneau is as high or higher than any other urban area in Alaska. So we have a very high cost of living, and part of which is taxes.
Mm-hmm. We're going to talk a little legal here. It sounds like the city was sued for not using a standard method of assessment. Can you talk a little more about this?
Well, that was in regard, very recently here, that was in regard to commercial real estate. So they look,
okay.
there's sort of two pots here. We have the residential property and we have the commercial property. So for business entities, they pay on a commercial basis. And the commercial assessments hadn't really been kept up to speed and had lagged behind, hadn't been redone in some time. And it is an obligation to the city to do a full and total valuation or assessment every year. So they kind of jumped ahead a few years, and these were some very, very substantial, like 50% increases in value on the assessment. There was a lawsuit over it, and the result of that lawsuit was an agreement that the city would now use these AAAO, IAAO criteria for doing commercial assessments, whereas before that they had not used any criteria. It was just whatever the assessor wanted to do. And one of the reasons which might justify that way of doing it, or at least what they said, is that there just aren't enough business properties changing hands to have comparables to say, well, this one sold for $5 and that one sold for $10 and this one's in the middle, so it's $7.50. They didn't have that. So they had to come up with something else, and that's just a bit of a guessing match. It's perhaps, we wouldn't want to say it's a guessing match, but somebody told me that.
How many years was commercial real estate property flat or not raised significantly?
Oh, I couldn't put an actual number on that, but they've lagged behind in their commercial assessments.
Okay, 10 years?
I don't think that.
Not that long.
No,
Okay.
I think that.
But interesting that what was it in 2022? Is that when they all went up 50%? The commercial.
I believe that was right. That's certainly it was last year that this whole thing went to court and was resolved.
Oh.
Okay.
So assessments is the first part of property taxes, but tell us more about the mill rate and its role in determining the amount of taxes each property owner pays annually.
Well, that is the question.
Okay.
Because there's two parts of it. This is a fourth grade math problem here. You got A times B
Okay.
equals tax.
Okay.
So C being tax, A times B equals C.
Right.
And you get your assessment, and people think, well, look at that, that's an assessment, great. Gee, I hope I don't owe that kind of tax. You know, that's a big number. Well, you don't. You own the result of the multiplication of your assessment times what's called the mill rate. And that's just a levy or a fraction of the value of your home, which they're going to collect as tax. And what is a house? I mean, basically, if you got a big pile of money and then you got a house, as far as the city is concerned, we'll just take the house away and we'll look at this as a big pile of money. So it's wealth. It's private property. You own this house, which is wealth, but it's expressed as a solid structure. It's not expressed as dollars. To you, it's your house. It's where you live. To the city, it's dollars. It's a pot of money.
Yeah.
So they're going to collect from you. They think of that as an asset, and they're going to collect from you a percentage of that every year. But you can't take like part of your bathroom and give that to them as tax every year, because that would be bad. So
That
they
would be
take.
They don't want the lumber.
They don't want the lumber, and besides, it's already been used. Although reclaimed lumber is actually quite expensive. But what they're going to do is they're going to dip into your checking account, and so say, rather than take part of your house, we'll just take part of your checking account. So, ouch, you got to pay out cash, your wages that you earn every year, in order to pay this portion of the wealth of your home. And how do they determine that? Well, they come up with this thing called a mill levy. Now, a mill is 1,000, right? Mill, 1,000.
Got it.
It's like cent is 100. So you think of percentages, percent, that's per 100.
Yeah.
But a mill is per 1,000.
Right.
So if it's so many mills, it's per 1,000s. And 1,000 is 1/10 of a percent per 100. So if it's 10 mills, it's 1%. And the city this year is going to be charging us 10.28 mills on your assessed value. So that's a little over 1% of your assessed value you have to turn over as cash. So that's where the real decision making gets made. The assessor is supposed to assess your value based on its full value. And we're going to argue a little bit about the accuracy of that. There's some unknowns there. We want to look at the comparables, what's happening to our neighbors, and get a good feel that, yeah, it's a reasonable estimate, or it's not a reasonable estimate. Let's argue about it if it's not. And then there's always a way to try to rectify that. If we can't come to agreement with the city, you can go to the equalization board, and that may or may not be helpful. But whatever the case, if you can come to an agreement on the assessed value, then you sit back and say, what's that mill rate can be, because that's what's going to hit my checkbook. And that's where the politics comes into it.
Yeah, heavy
So-
politics.
Property taxes due when each year?
Property tax would be, good question.
Last
Is it in September?
Yeah, it's September 30th.
Yes,
My bill's
yes,
over
yes.
there. I'm staring at it. Orange paper.
Yeah.
Due on or before September 30th, 2023. Some information for you all out there. Make sure you got that date on your calendar.
So I know a lot of people, because a lot of people are like, I don't get that orange piece of paper. We should say you probably do get the orange piece of paper, but you don't see it as a bill. Why is that?
Right.
Well, most people are paying through their home purchase, through their
Escrow.
payment every year,
Oh.
through
okay.
escrow.
Oh.
So
okay.
just like your insurance, your hazard insurance on your home, this is just something added to the escrow. So every month you're paying out 20, 40, 200, whatever it might be, dollars. And if you're having an automatic deduction through your credit card or something like that, through your bank, where you're not even writing a check anymore, that's just money, poof, disappears, and you don't necessarily see it, and you tend to lose focus on it. But somebody who's paying a check and actually does not use escrow and pays that bill either on a semi-annual or annual basis, well, then you feel it.
So when people may see a little bit of increase come October in their mortgage payment, they're like, wait, $1,400, $1,600? Why? What is going on? It might be an indication that their property tax went up.
It sure could be. Could be insurance, but you would want to logically check that out. Where's my money going?